Hey friends, welcome back to Drawing the Line, the official podcast of the NDRC. As usual, my name is Marina Jenkins, and I'm joined by our president, John Bisignano.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Marina, let's talk about Ohio. Let's spend some time on Ohio today. It has been such a big part of our lives for so long.
So many years. And Ohio is the only state that we know of this year. This could change due to litigation. It's the only state that we know of this year that is for sure redrawing its congressional map. So the reason the Ohio map is getting redrawn this year is because the original map that was passed after the 2020 census was not passed on a bipartisan basis. So we'll go back through, we can go in the Wayback Machine and talk a little bit about how we got to where we are, and then what we expect to happen this year in Ohio. It's a tough state, and I think there's been a lot of real energy over the past 10 years for redistricting reform, and unfortunately, those reforms just haven't really produced the outcomes that voters have been hoping for.
Yeah, I think if anything, over the past, and really now it's 15 years, voters have been clear in the window of time post 2010 redraw that they do not want gerrymandered maps. And I feel as though they've tried to be clear about that many, many times, and yet specifically in the state, Republican politicians continue to hold on to minority rule in a way that is dramatically inhibiting the ability for the voters to be heard.
Yeah. So I'm going to start us after the 2011 census, because I think it's helpful to understand the historic context here and where we've come from and how we got where we are. So in the after the 2010 census, Ohio had 16 seats, and the Republicans in the legislature after the 2010 census gerrymandered the congressional map so that 12 Republicans and only 4 Democrats were sent to Congress. And of course, that was not reflective of the voting public in the state. That was not reflective of where voters were and, what you would expect to come from what was at the time a much more purple state. We can sort of have a conversation about where Ohio is currently politically, but certainly, this was not reflective of Ohio's voters.
Yeah, I mean, remember that Barack Obama won Ohio in 2008.
Yeah.
It was not that long ago.
It was not that long ago.
Maybe that dates us. That's
so
kind of a long time ago, but
it was kind of a long time ago. I know. I try not to date myself too much, but it's hard. So you have that bad map, and then Ohio voters and advocates in the state got to work trying to improve the system and introduce redistricting reform in the state. And this takes place over the course of 2 separate ballot initiative efforts, one in 2015, and then for the state legislative map, and then one in 2018. And NDRC is founded in the midst of all of this. Organization is formally founded in 2016, starts staffing up 2017. So we're just coming to be, as all of this is happening, so much energy in Ohio. They pass a sort of combined process that involves both the legislature and a commission that is comprised of statewide elected officials and representatives from the legislature. And basically, you have a process for the state legislative maps that has really stringent rules, and then a process for the congressional map that has less stringent rules, but still importantly prohibits partisan gerrymandering. So that's a big step. Ohio is sort of on the front end of the fight of the redistricting reform movement in the 2010s with these 2 bills. Fast forward to, post 2020 census. advocates are hoping and fighting for a fair map that gives, the voters in Ohio a level of representation that is equal to what their numbers would show. But unfortunately, again, you get a really gerrymandered map. There are improvements. It's better than it could have been, or than it would have been, without those new laws in the state constitution. But our affiliate ended up suing both maps, challenging both maps in court, and the Ohio State Supreme Court struck down the congressional map twice and the state legislative maps 5 times. So you end up having 7 rulings from the state Supreme Court, but ultimately Republicans in the state were just simply refused to comply with the criteria in the Constitution, and would just repeatedly pass a gerrymander again and again and again.
Right. Let's talk about why.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Yeah.
obviously, if you're listening and you're thinking it went to the Supreme Court, they ruled it a gerrymander. Why didn't it just get fixed? And then you say, oh, well, congressional map 2 times. Why would it be 2 times? State legislative map 5 times. That seems crazy. How is that possible?
Yeah.
The reason is the Supreme Court, specifically a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, stated that they didn't feel that they said it was gerrymandered and it was not constitutional. The map is not constitutional. But they also stated that given the language in the provision and the Constitution, they didn't feel as though they had the authority to redraw. So they would return the map to the state legislature or the commission and say, this is not a valid map.
Yeah.
Please fix it and give us a valid map. And the legislature just ran out the clock. They just continued to produce absurdly gerrymandered maps and then return them to the courts. And then the courts would say, this is gerrymandered, but we can't do anything about it beyond ask you to please change it. Now, we argued that wasn't the case and that they should have had the authority to redraw. But the majority on the court did not feel that to be the case.
So, certainly this was more than frustrating for folks in the state and for the advocates who had fought so hard to pass those ballot initiatives. And to be clear, those were put on the ballot on a bipartisan basis. So the Republicans who campaigned on redistricting reform in 2016 and 2018 then turned around and passed maps that violated those provisions. And, it was, certainly today we are in a situation where elected officials are and politicians at the federal level are, openly going back on things that they've campaigned on. There's no shortage of examples that we could provide to show this. There's no shortage of examples, unfortunately, to show, disdain for the rule of law, disdain for court decisions, disdain for decisions coming out of what are supposed to be, independent judicial bodies. But as this was happening in Ohio, it was certainly not something that we expected, right? Like, you expect some level of, okay, well, we're going to run on this, but we're going to be weaselly and not really mean what we say. You don't expect like the complete 180 that we saw. And we certainly didn't expect at that time the extent of comfort that the Republicans seem to have with simply ignoring a dictate from the state's highest court.
Yeah. I mean, we start, as you noted, we started our work in 2017. And I pretty often say we mapped out in 2017 different scenarios, right? Each state had different scenarios at different levels. Maybe if this governor wins, this will happen. If this happens, this will happen. And Ohio, and we were pretty close. I feel pretty good. If you look back at our thinking in 2017 as to where we landed, we were pretty close, except Ohio. I really, none of us could have imagined that a state legislature would buck a Supreme Court once, let alone 5 times or 7 times. It's so asinine. And it does, we've talked about on this podcast before, different scenarios in which legislators or commissions have flaunted the court system, like in North Carolina, for example, where they completely
Hmm.
reversed a decision just a few months after, or even at the U.S. Supreme Court, where they said, unfortunately, we can't tell what gerrymandering is. It's impossible. I'm blind. I can't, but but this was a new one
Yeah.
where it wasn't them. They didn't even have the ability to reverse something. They simply said, which is very rare for a Supreme Court in a state, they said, we have no ability to fix the problem. They
Right.
said, no one has given us the authority to fix the problem, which is, you don't see that in any other walk of law. You don't see like a court have a murder trial and then have them say, well, we
Yeah.
definitely think this person did it,
Yeah.
but we can't put them
Well,
away.
and it was an interesting moment of foresight or maybe foresight is not the right word, but it was an interesting foreshadowing, I suppose is the better word, of this idea of being in a constitutional crisis, which it feels like we are very
Yeah.
much in now, with respect to, I think the court knew, well, obviously they knew, and the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth iteration of the legislature or the commission simply not following their decision. But on that question of like enforcement mechanism, it really is, you know I think there was a concern that they sort of forced their hand and still are not, that's, you're sort of still not complied with, right? And so it does create this very dangerous and bizarre world in which the court was seemingly afraid to assert itself because it kind of expected it was not going to be listened
Yeah.
to, and that undermines its own legitimacy, right? And so there's
Right.
that, like, and that's what we're seeing right now, where basically at a federal level, government just, the administration just ignoring some court orders and or just not following through, right? Like federal funding freezes, et cetera. And it creates a very dangerous sort of position for the court to be in when they can anticipate that they're going to be ignored. And what does that mean for their power and the power of that institution? And so, very heady questions, I think,
Yeah.
for the court to be engaged in. And so we really did see that start that bad behavior, and sort of undermining and dismissiveness of the rule of law in Ohio ahead of what we're seeing now.
And fear. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's clear. Like what you're talking about is similar at the federal level to what's happening with nominations right now, where the Senate has completely, from my perspective, advocated their role
Yeah.
of a vetter of
Right.
any of these nominees. Right? No one has had the backbone to stand up and say this person isn't going to be equipped to do this job. We should find someone else.
Right.
There's a lot of people in this country, and we can
Right.
find one of them that's better than this person. uh, and so, but the fear of retribution, the fear of political retribution, is so clear that you're seeing
Yeah.
that type of cowardice, and
Yeah.
it's a scary thing. But you're right; it
Yeah.
started in Ohio.
Yeah.
It was a unique moment in time to witness and experience, and just for folks' awareness, the way that it ended up getting rectified was that Republicans also filed a case in federal court,
Yeah.
trying to move the process along. And eventually, a federal court said they weren't going to interject in whether it was
Right.
gerrymandered or not, but they were just going to say, yeah, this is a map. You need to have a map for the election.
Yeah.
So when I say they ran out the clock, that's what I mean. They ostensibly waited long enough that a federal court stepped in and said this state needs to have a map for its congressional elections that are coming up very soon, and it will be it will choose the most recent version
Yeah.
of the Republican
Yeah.
gerrymander.
The federal case was with respect to the state ledge map, and then I think the congressional, they just, I think it just was like at that point they also ran out of time. I can't even, it was such mayhem. But because of all of this, the maps were not in compliance with sort of the best practices put forward by these reforms in 2015 and 2018. And one of the consequences of that, so even with this running out the clock and getting to use a bad map, the rules in the Ohio Constitution say that, okay, well, that map doesn't get to stand for the full decade because they did not pass it on a bipartisan basis. And so now it goes back and they have to draw again. So that is why we now have another redraw in Ohio this year. The state legislative map was already redrawn once again in 2023. So, Ohio's just sort of seen this drumbeat of redistricting activity, even though, the voters have been very clear about what they want in the past. I will say we should talk about the ballot initiative that failed last year before we get to the redraw for this year, which is to say voters in 2015 and 2018 overwhelmingly supported redistricting reforms. It was campaigned on a bipartisan basis, right? Both Republicans and Democrats said, yes, we support this. We need to have redistricting reform. You had a very different situation this past year when, after the utter failure of those reforms to protect voters in Ohio, after the 2020 census, advocates went back to the drawing board and tried again to get truly comprehensive redistricting reform introduced in Ohio, which would require an independent redistricting commission. So Ohio's current commission that gets involved in redistricting, as we noted, is a commission made up of elected officials. The proposal that was on the ballot in 2024 was to create a truly independent process that would not be subject to the influence of elected officials in Ohio. So that was a big, big, big campaign. Our organization was, deeply supportive and committed to trying to see that across the finish line last year. And ultimately, it was unsuccessful. But it was unsuccessful because of the sort of really deeply cynical way that Republicans worked to defeat it, which is to just lie and recast their position against the ballot initiative as, if you vote no against this ballot initiative, that's how you're going to stop gerrymandering. So they basically just said, it's just like what my kids would just be like, it's just opposite day. It's just like they just lie and they just say the opposite of what something is, and completely confused Ohio voters who, as we know from past experiences, do overwhelmingly want a better redistricting process than what they've gotten.
Yeah, of course they do. And not gerrymandering maps polls around 72 to 75% every time, right? We've polled it constantly in different states. There's a lot of things that happened in Ohio this cycle. And one, I just want to acknowledge on the front end, Dems did very poorly in Ohio, right? For the most part, outside of the congressional level, there was not a lot of success. And obviously we saw Senator Brown lose, and it was a really difficult environment. That said, normally in a normal environment, an anti-gerrymandering bill would run higher than anybody else, because it would be seen similarly bipartisan, or at least draw interest from both sides. Nobody likes gerrymandering, right? No voter likes gerrymandering. No one likes to understand that their vote doesn't count, in a way that they think it should. And what Marina was describing just now is cynical, but it was malicious. I mean, there were, yard signs across the state that said vote yes on issue 1, end gerrymandering. And there were yard signs across the state that said vote no on issue 1, end gerrymandering. And it's so sad when you have an issue that clearly you can't say why you want it, right? They want it. If they said why they wanted it, they would have put up a sign that said, give us all the power. Let us draw maps regardless of who deserves it, right? That's not what they did, because it wouldn't have worked. So they did what they thought would work, and they confused voters to a point where it was unsuccessful. And it is devastating. It's a devastating loss for the state and for the country. I think one other part of it that has grown quite frustrating in the past, I don't know, since that campaign and a little bit beyond, is there's a conflation of the word gerrymandering and
Mm.
redistricting that
Mm-hmm.
Republicans have been tending to do to try and muddle the issue, right?
Yeah.
Gerrymandering, to me, to be clear,
Yeah.
is taking undue power via the map drawing process and governing with it, right? It's not more complicated than that. Obviously, in Ohio, the maps do that. What
Right.
they will say, Dems want a gerrymander, and what they mean by that is they want to redraw the maps to create a fair environment.
Right.
But they'll use the same verbiage and they'll try and confuse people, and it's irritating because we're simply seeking a fair operating field for either party's ideas to compete and be successful. Now, like, I happen to be a person that believes that democratic values would perform well in a fair map, right? I think the ideas are better, right? But that doesn't mean that I think every single state should be locked into democratic control. And so, obviously, Ohio is a disappointment.
Yeah.
Um, but we do still have a redraw in front of us now.
Yeah. It's such an important point, though, about the language. And I think, one of the things that we often try and make clear is, you have to redistrict. You don't have to gerrymander, right? So there's like the first
There's such
distinction
long
is
words. It's so
redistricting is
confusing.
not
It's so confusing.
redistricting is a morally neutral thing that has to happen, right? Like that's
Yeah.
just like it is a thing that has to happen in order to comply with our Constitution.
And because
Gerrymandering,
population changes,
right?
not
Because
just
of
because of the
population
Constitution.
changes,
It's totally reasonable. It's
right?
totally reasonable that in any
Right.
state you need to
Neutral,
redraw districts every somewhat period of years because people move around. Of
right?
course.
Right. Although that, a story for another day is that was groundbreaking in the 60s. And there's an amazing podcast that talks about that decision, which is called Baker v. Carr, and like how fraught that was at the time for the Supreme Court. This legal nerd moment.
Don't
Sidebar.
plug other podcasts. There's only one podcast.
I know, yeah. No, but but the point that you're saying, which I think is really important, because I think also they have exported this from Ohio, which is using the language to say that any time that maps need to be redrawn and any time that maps are being redrawn in order to provide fair representation, that Republicans are calling that gerrymandering. So, the accusation that, enforcement of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in Alabama is gerrymandering for Democrats, when actually, no, what that's doing is enforcing a federal law from the civil rights movement that says that Black voters ought to have equal access to, fair representation. But goodness gracious, if we do that, then that's gerrymandering. But that's just
it's not what it means. It's not what the word means. So they're just
right.
It's simply a different definition. They're using a different definition. It's
right.
like if you call stealing something different,
Yeah.
Like maybe it's not stealing to you if you pursue a surge and then a decrease in the stock market and then grab a bunch of stock in between. Maybe you don't see that as stealing. I would see that as stealing. To me, that's stealing.
What could you possibly be referring to, Ben?
Anyways, we can cut
that. No, but it's and I think it's also this. I think you're right. Like, cynicism is not even the right word, because it is truly malicious and it is truly manipulative to just like say the opposite of what you mean, or and I think Republicans have been guilty of this for a long time, right? There's all the various legislation, like names of different bills that are like Save America's Earth is like the bill that they introduced to like to drill in federal lands, right? Like,
fracking, just
we're used to that level of sleight of hand with their language, I suppose. But I do think we're in a new universe where it's like projection. They're just like, oh no, you're the ones who are gerrymandering because you want us to draw the maps in a particular way, and we're like, yeah, we want you to draw the maps so they're fair and represent the people. Like, that is not manipulating the map that is protecting voters' rights. And what they're doing is manipulating the map, but it's like they just try and win this
Yeah.
language war. All right. So I could
It's
vent
real.
about this. I could rant about this for days. But one way or the other, there's a new redraw happening this year in Ohio. And I think what we're watching for is ensuring that, and what we're working toward is ensuring that what happens in Ohio this year is not what happened in North Carolina last year, which is to say, Ohio's map right now, congressional map right now, is not fair, does not represent the people as they should, right? It doesn't provide the level of representation that we think is appropriate. Yet, Republicans in state could do much worse. And I think that's kind of the concern, is to ensure that the effort in Ohio is not sort of like a complete dismantling of everything to the extent possible, right? Where they're just completely obliterating Democratic representation in the state just because they can.
So we do have a redraw coming up this year in Ohio. So it's exciting. As you noted earlier, it's the only state that we're absolutely sure will redraw their maps. I think there are going to be more, but it's the only state we're sure. And so our organization and partners on the ground are going to be monitoring vigilantly, trying to ensure the best possible outcome, because as we've already noted, Republicans have tried a number of different ways to ensure a more gerrymandered, more isolated control map than we've seen ever. And so we've seen this across the country in different states. We are going to be vigilant and to stay on top of it. And you should, if you would like to help, please join us at democraticredistricting.com and jump in the fray. It's a lot of work to do in Ohio this year.
A lot of work to do. All right, folks, thank you for joining us today and tuning in. We look forward to keeping you up to date. Please share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you and anything you're interested in hearing from us.
This show is produced by Reed Dudley, Sophia Pedroso, and Manuel Marce. Special thanks to Alex Yang. Editing and mixing by Play Pretend Media. This podcast is paid for by the National Democratic Redistricting Committee.